So I just want to welcome everybody to the first LTER Network Office webinar series. And we are really excited, and we are, from now until June, we're going to be featuring the results and the progress of the first set of LTER synthesis working groups here at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. And we currently have 6 active groups now. They're in various stages of their work, and the groups have come together largely around the priority efforts of or the priority topics of the LTR program. So research on things like productivity and population dynamics, disturbance, lots of other exciting topics. I've left the schedule up here, and this is also available online. The webinars are all going to be scheduled for the second Thursday of each month, and you guys are here, so you already know that, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And again, you can access this schedule on our website. So before I introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Stephanie Hampton, I just want to give a little bit about the Zoom webinar and how we're going to handle questions in particular. So throughout the webinar, you can use the Q&A button. It should be on your meeting controls, which is that bar either on the top or the bottom of your webinar screen. When you hover your mouse over it, you ought to be able to see it. And in that Q&A place, you can type your questions. Please feel free to do that throughout the whole seminar, but we will not be addressing questions until the very end. So we'll be holding the questions, but as they come to you, you can type them in there. After Dr. Hampton is through with her webinar, if time permits, you could also use the raise your hand button, also in your meeting controls. And that if, again, we will curate those, we'll try to call on you, again, it's time permitting. And if you can, if you'd like to, please maybe say your name and your institution or your agency or where you come from when asking questions of Dr. Hampton. So those are 2 ways that you can ask questions. The presentation will be recorded, as will all of these webinars, and placed on our website as well. So if you don't get to ask your question, you may be able to contact the speaker later, but you can watch the webinar again. Okay, so it's with great pleasure that I would like to introduce our leadoff speaker, Dr. Stephanie Hampton. Steph is a professor at Washington State University and in the school environment. She's also the director for the Center for Environmental Research, Education, and Outreach at Washington State University. Her research ranges from basic science, most notably in aquatic ecosystems, through to data science and environmental policy. And prior to Steph's position at Washington State, she was deputy director here at NCEAS, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. Steph is a strong advocate and a promoter for data sharing, for open science, and also for the use of cutting-edge informatics for effective and, importantly, transparent environmental research. So we're really pleased today she's going to be presenting on the science of team science, lessons from synthesis centers. So we'll swap screens here, might take about a minute, and then I turn the floor over to Dr. Stephanie Hampton. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for that nice introduction. I'm going to try to speak while I navigate the screen sharing thing. Okay. Oh, I see what's happening. Did that work, you guys?
I see it.
That's great. Okay, let me just look real quick at my controls. Let's see. One of the things that I know is happening is that my video is occasionally stopping. And so I'm just looking to see if I have any control over sharing my video while I have this in view. Sorry to be hanging you guys up for a second. I don't really, maybe. No, that didn't work. Okay. Sorry, guys.
Turn off her video. Am I? Yes, Steph, we can turn off
Yep.
your video.
Yeah, that's probably best because I am certain it will hang up.
Okay, so
Okay.
Great. And we turn off mine as well, Marty? There we go.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. I could see it doing it, like 3 times a minute while we were sort of prepping. So, all right, let's get started. Thanks so much for inviting me to talk to you guys. Long-term ecological research is very near and dear to my heart, and certainly these issues of how we collaborate effectively is also something that's been a big part of my life. And I owe basically everything I know about these topics to a lot of my collaborators. So this is a little bit meta to give this sort of talk about team science, and really start the talk having to acknowledge that that I have learned so much from the people that I really actively collaborate with, and relative to this talk, especially some of the sociologists who have collaborated with me, continue to collaborate with me, and especially those who have studied the synthesis centers. So John Parker and Ed Hackett, in particular, who have done a lot of work where they were actually embedded at NCEAS, at National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. So we'll start there, and just recognize that there were many, many other people who have been a part of this work, and I really appreciate their efforts. So I think many, if not all of us who are logged onto this call know that ecology has a very individualistic history, and it's not unique to ecology. Many other sciences were have this tradition of people really working solo, and keeping their ideas somewhat protected, thinking about the sort of credit that may accrue to them from their work, and making sure that it's very clear that that it's their credit for their ideas and their hard work, and also really keeping their data close for lots of reasons. And I could say that part of this too is really an issue of control, is really controlling the direction of your research. I mean, this is something that I think that many of us, especially some of the mid-career and established scientists on the call, were really trained to do science in this way, in this highly individualistic manner. And it's only more recently, I think in the past several decades, that ecologists have become much more collaborative. And again, this is not unique to ecology. There are other fields that are way ahead of us in terms of being very open and transparent and oriented towards team science. There are also fields that we are light years ahead of, so we can feel good sometimes too. So this sort of individualistic history and tradition is also reflected in the way that awards are distributed. So this is Brian Hydorn did this really nice study of the distribution of award size from across National Science Foundation. So this is quite broad and not specific to ecology here, ranging from these really big projects that there's very few of, more sort of infrastructure type of projects, down to what a lot of ecologists will be very familiar with. My dissertation research, which used a lot of duct tape and other things you can buy in the hardware store. So lots of projects that are smaller budgets. And this is structured this way for really good reasons. I mean, the idea is this, let many flowers grow, where lots of projects can prosper and lots of new ideas can grow in this sort of space where we have many, many smaller awards. But it also does have the effect of creating some silos among individuals who may be working on smaller projects. And of course, NSF and other funders do recognize this and try to set up mechanisms for those individual projects to talk across to each other. So, through workshop funding or through research coordination network funds and those sorts of things, so that we can try to have the best of both worlds, where we grow lots and lots of different projects, but we also we also try to encourage that sort of cross-pollination. Well, one of the features of this sort of distribution of projects, where we have lots and lots of small individualistic projects, is that for the really big projects that we have very few of, the data tend to be well planned and well managed, whereas for most of us out here in the long tail, unfortunately, a lot of these data fall into the dark data, where these smaller projects don't have a lot of data management and frequently not a lot of data sharing. And again, this is common across the sciences based on this analysis by Brian Hydorn. And so this can reinforce some of the barriers to individual scientists working across boundaries to talk to each other. So having seen this study, of course, I wonder, I know my ecologist collaborators they love to collaborate. And I wonder how common dark data are in ecology. And so just doing an analysis in, I think these were awards from 2005 to 2010. And the pattern really reflects what you see for science as a whole in terms of the awards that are given out in Division of Environmental Biology, which funds a lot of what we do in ecology. And so one can anticipate that with this sort of distribution, like Hydorn suggests for science overall, that ecology probably does also have a lot of dark data that tends to continue to reinforce some of the boundaries among these individual researchers. Okay, so how dark are ecology's dark data? This is, I think this is a really hard question to address. And one of the reasons is that when, we do send out lots of surveys to scientists asking them, about their data practices, and so that we can try to get a better idea of how many people are sharing, how many people are interested in sharing. But unfortunately, you do get a fair amount of response bias in a survey like that, where the people who answer are typically people who they're pretty happy with their data practices, and they also care about the issue enough to actually answer your survey. And so what we did to answer this question was to take a boots on the ground approach to look at how available are ecology's data. And by the boots on the ground approach, what I mean is that we did a survey of awards from DEB at National Science Foundation, so environmental biology, and we sampled papers from each of 100 awards, and then we tried to hunt down the data. We made what we would call reasonable efforts to hunt down the data. And so this would be, reading through the paper in a systematic way, looking at author information in a systematic way, and Googling in a systematic way. And we stopped just short of actually contacting people. And we thought, well, this is, as somebody who uses a lot of very different data sets in my own work, this is essentially what I would consider reasonable efforts to locate data that somebody might presume to be public. And what we found was that only 8% of the papers had any data, any non-genetic data that were discoverable through these means. And so that doesn't mean that 8% of the data were available. It doesn't mean that 8% of the papers had 100% of the data available. It really means only 8% had any of the data available that supported the papers in ecology. So pretty dark. Okay, so we turn to ask to our sociologist friends, why are these data dark? Why are people not sharing their data? And again, sort of reinforcing some of these more traditional individualistic approaches to science. So the issues that people raise tend to be pretty consistent, and I'll just really quickly review some of those and some of the answers that are out there in the literature. So first, people say they don't want to lose their rights to these data, and people mean different things by this, but frequently these issues can be addressed by writing really clear metadata. So for example, having your data set published in a way that can be cited, so it's really clear how people cite your data set, so that you're continuing to get credit when people use your data. If your issue is that you really want people to contact you, then I think it's totally fine to put in your metadata that you would really welcome contact from people. And certainly for people who are thinking about using somebody else's data, I always encourage you to contact the data provider, because you would get so much more out of having a great interaction with that person and potentially a collaboration. People are also afraid that others will steal their data, but if you publish it, it really establishes your priority. It's pretty darn clear that those are your data. And so if somebody were to use it and not credit you, it would be pretty obvious to everybody. And so that is an issue that I think is obviated really by actually publishing the data and making it clear where it came from. And also, it turns out stealing is not that common as far as we can tell. So John Porter did some of this legwork, especially with the LTER survey. In a survey of LTER data sharing practices and data issues, there was a very small fraction of LTER data downloads that generated any problems, and none of these issues involved infringement. And then from personal communication with one of the editors for ESA, they could only track also a very small number of disputes, and none of these came, they didn't sort of come out of the blue. They came from former colleagues or former student-mentor combinations. And again, it was a very small percentage. So stealing is just not that common as far as we can tell from those metrics. Well, sharing does take time and money. That is certainly an issue. And so, you know, what we can say when you're writing a grant proposal is to budget for it. That our funders are telling us that they want us to share our data and they want us to collaborate with each other. And it is perfectly reasonable to budget for data management because it is a lot of time and it takes expertise. So I know that that's hard when you're like me and you start up really exciting projects without a budget, but certainly we can plan for it as best as we can. And then I would make the pitch that sharing also advertises your expertise. And this has been my experience as a researcher myself. It's also been our experience when I was at NCEAS for 8 years, was that when somebody's data are available, other people find out that that person has this resource, and they also have the expertise to help to interpret it, and it can lead to collaborations. So why should we start to break out of this individualistic sort of mindset and engage in team science? I think it's intellectually really exciting for a lot of us to scale up from the individual observation. So I think about my colleagues Megan McKenna and John Kalambakidis, who have this incredible expertise to get high value observations of whale diving behavior. And these observations that take so much skill and so much money, frankly, to collect can be integrated with other observations elsewhere and with larger scale data sets to get even more value out of these hard-won data, and of course are turn into super interesting projects for Megan and John. And I think I think all of us recognize, I don't have to say most of us, I think all of us recognize that a lot of the environmental problems that many of us want to address really occur at challenges that at scales that individuals just can't address. We really need to work with each other to get that kind of not only the spatial coverage, but also the broad expertise we need to interpret patterns that are occurring at large scales. And certainly we all recognize that the science landscape is changing. So, you know, my research group, for example, we're very proficient with working with long-term data sets, integrating them with other similar long-term data sets. When it comes time to try to integrate with some remote sensing data that might be really relevant to a project or genomic data, I have to reach out to colleagues, and it wouldn't make any sense for me to try to develop that kind of expertise in my own lab group. And a lot of these projects, as we get into team science, are really the high impact science. So this is an example of Lizzie Wolkovich putting together warming experiments that the results from these warming experiments, when they put them all together, they recognize that the results would underpredict the actual changes, phenological responses that are being seen out in the world. And so this can, of course, it was big news, and also can really help to redesign experiments and have high impact. And of course, nutrient network is another example that comes to mind of this networked science that has very high impact and high profile. And this is reflected in the metrics. So traditional metrics like citation or impact factor, but also some of the newer metrics that are being developed in part to try to understand the impact that team science is having on the development of science. So this is a paper by Wupti et al. From 2007. And I should mention I have a slide at the end that'll have all of the citations. And so for those of you who want to hunt down some of these resources, this is a great resource demonstrating that teams have really come to dominate the scientific landscape in terms of their impact. And so in this case, they're looking at citation rates as the metric. But there are also some more novel metrics that are coming onto the landscape. And so this is Uzi et al. From about 4 years ago. And in this case, you've got team authors over here on the red lines. And this is evaluating the novelty of the papers based on the papers that they cite. So they've got over 10,000 papers in this corpus where they analyze the citations in those papers and see how far they deviate from what would be sort of normal or median. And so they can evaluate novelty, and then they can also attribute how much of that novelty is associated with what the structure of the authorship. So solo authors tend to have a lower probability of having a very highly cited paper, even when it has high novelty. Whereas the team authors are hitting those marks a lot more readily across the board. And then I think that there's a lot of exciting work that's being done with metrics, and I think many of us really we all express, I think, that we want to get away from some of these traditional metrics, or we want to add to some of these traditional metrics. That citations never tell the whole story, and impact factor never tells the whole story. And frequently what we're asking, we're not asking how many people cited your paper, we're really asking, did you engage in something that is novel? Did you do something that we could really call transformative? Did you break down some boundaries? And so we have a group, this is a group of mostly sociologists and scientists that Nescent brought together to to try to develop some of these approaches, novel approaches to assessing the impact of synthesis. So synthesis as one form of collaboration, and synthesis centers. And so those results are not published, but this is just a quick preview of thinking about how we evaluate the novelty of a paper based on text analysis, and then how we might be able to then look at the novelty of papers as they're laid out across a landscape of other papers that are generated across science, and see, well, do these products of synthesis and team science, do they fall at the interstices? Do they have higher novelty? These are some of the questions that we're hoping to address in a soon to be published, I hope, paper. So those are some of the great reasons to do team science based on increasing your impact as a scientist. But I can tell you that one of the major reasons, if not the major reason, that I engage in team science myself, and why I love supporting other people who are doing team science, is that it's fun. It's so intellectually engaging. And I can't tell you the number of people who at NCEAS or in my research center here at WSU report back on these conversations they had with somebody they didn't know they had anything in common with, and it completely opened a new door. I mean, Mark McPeak at Dartmouth will tell you that a conversation that he had on the beach one day after an NCEAS working group meeting really changed the trajectory of his research. And I think many of us could point to those sorts of exciting sort of moments in working in teams. And in fact, so this is the Global Lake Temperature Collaboration team that I work with very frequently. And a question that I get, especially when I'm meeting new people at WSU, you know, they'll frequently say, well, how large is your research group? And of course, by that, they don't mean how large is the research center that I run, but really, you know, my own group, my lab group. And I realize I only pay 3 people, but I don't think of them as my own research group. I think of my research group, when I think of them, are dozens of people who I regularly collaborate with. And I think a lot of us who are now doing a lot of team science think about our research groups in that way. But it's not easy. It's not all easy. I mean, I think most of it is fun, but it gets a lot more fun as you start to learn how to do it. And so this is this old parable that most, if not all of us know about, how, you know, it's told in several different ways. So you have several blind or blindfolded people who touch different parts of an elephant, and they're asked what is the object they're touching. So the person touching the trunk says, oh, it's a snake. The person touching the tusk says it's a spear. The person touching the leg says, oh, this is the trunk of a tree, and so on and so forth. And then there are several versions of how this parable ends. So in some versions, they just fight and go away and get nothing done. And then in other versions, they start listening to each other, and they figure out that it is actually an elephant. That's always been the ending that I remember. But I am reminded that there are other endings in the way that this parable is told. And of course, that is a great metaphor for working in teams in general. So this is some work that from the business project management literature that Kendra Cheruvalil and a group of authors summarized. And so I've actually put up a figure from their paper, which is a redrawing of a figure from Smith and Embry paper. And I think most of us probably can relate to this figure. It's a way that in the sort of project management and teamwork scholarship world, we think about different types of teams. And of course, there's gradients, and all of us can flip back and forth among these categories at various times. Okay, so if you just gave each person a task to do, or if you, let's think about funding, if you just gave them each a separate award, they would get a certain amount done based on their own merits. Now, if you tell them that they have to work together, but they really don't have any reason to work together, and it's not clear what the benefit is, then you can end up with a very dysfunctional team where actually less gets done than if you had just let them work by themselves. Well, they can get a little bit better if they do have some reason to collaborate, if each of them holds a piece to the puzzle. But in this case, they're still not exactly as good as they would have been if they just worked separately, because now they're having to make phone calls to each other and having to check in with each other, but they're not actually getting anything out of it. So that's probably not a well thought out team. It's certainly not a well thought out team. And then for those of us who are probably still hanging in there with team science, it's because we've had this amazing experience of being part of a high performing team where we complement each other. We have fun, we get excited because somebody has a new analysis that we didn't know anything about, they're willing to share it, and we can develop something that is far more than we could have done alone. And then Smith and Embry also have studied these highest performing teams. And these are the rare unicorns. And I like to think I've been part of at least one of these teams. And I think one of the things that Smith and Embry say about them is that these are the teams that really care about each other. You see them doing things that look a little bit altruistic. There's no clear benefit to the way that they're helping each other in a moment, but it's because they're committed. They're committed to each other's success above and beyond what you would simply see in a complementary team that respects each other. You see something more coming out of these highest performing teams. So the synthesis centers give us a chance to study some of this gradient. And I like to think that everything the synthesis centers have supported has been a wild success, and I think they probably have been in various ways. But there are certainly some that are extraordinarily successful, and others that simply produce less than they thought they would. And I think that, you know, I am ready to accept failure as the cost of taking some well-deserved risk in supporting groups. So the synthesis centers, probably most of you are pretty knowledgeable about what they do, but essentially they are there to support collaboration. So NSF has supported a number of synthesis centers in the US, and then there are a lot of them around the world as well. And you'll see, got down here a web address for the Synthesis Consortium. And this is where the leaders of these synthesis centers get together and try to share strengths and share lessons. So some of what I'm talking about comes from interactions with those groups. So the centers host hundreds of visitors each year. NCs would have dozens of working groups coming to the center every year, and then dozens of residents who are at the center, postdocs and sabbaticals in-house, who interact a lot with the working groups. And so it gives us a chance to study the process, because when we started out, we were keeping track of all this logistical stuff about how, you know, who's coming to the center, what working groups are there, how big are their groups, how long is it between their meetings, what's the gender balance in the group, what are the institutions, what are the disciplines of all these researchers. And we just had to keep track of that stuff to make sure that we could host your group. The lights are on when you show up at the door, and also so we could report to NSF. Well, it turns out after 15 years, we had a ton of data on what sort of factors were associated with group productivity. And one of the things that we could see, John Parker, actually pictured here, tells me that this is completely normal, that this is what you see across all sectors of societies and all types of groups, that 30% of the groups contribute 70% of the productivity. And that's what you see at NCEAS, that you got lots of people being very productive, and then you have some that are just knocking it out of the ballpark. And so one of the things that we're able to do with that data set at NCEAS and other synthesis centers will be able to do as those databases mature is to look at some of the factors that might be associated with some of this highest productivity or associated with productivity overall. And so we did do this analysis, John and I, where we looked at the number of publications and we looked at the impact factor. And I recognize that those are very unsatisfactory metrics. So having said that, it's what we had in the database, and I think it's useful to look at. And what we found in doing a multivariate analysis was that it's not just the amount of time that a group is active, but it's the number of meetings they have. So how many times do they actually get together face to face? And so you've got a number of factors. First of all, you've got your accountability to your colleagues. If you're going to see somebody in person, a lot of people feel that accountability much more strongly. And then you also have that face-to-face time where you've got what John Parker calls peer review on the fly. So you can vet these ideas much more quickly and really get things done and get to places that you simply may not get over email. We also found that the number of residents who were involved in the working groups also boosted productivity. So it was also another significant factor. And so the idea is that these residents, like the postdocs and the sabbaticals, are coming in with some experience from group to group and also can maintain momentum of the working groups from meeting to meeting. And then John was super excited about this, and I didn't really understand why until I read the literature that he was pointing me to, that the number of institutions that were represented in a group also helped to predict higher productivity. And so he told me that as much as institutions and organizations have wanted to promote cross-institutional collaboration, that frequently the transactional friction is so great that it tends to make groups less productive. And so what we found at NCEAS is that if we want multi-institutional collaboration, that the synthesis centers have a recipe that works. So he convinced me that that is indeed an exciting result. So these working groups are productive. How much did the culture change? Do the people change through doing this sort of collaboration? So Ed Hackett had done sociological studies on NCEAS and did some survey work. And the working group participants in his survey said, 74% that said that they thought they would be more collaborative after the working group, and 77% said they thought they'd be more willing to share their data. And so we're able to assess a little bit of that by using our database at NCEAS as well. So what we did there was to look at some of the participants. So we restricted the group of participants that we looked at for various reasons, to make the analysis tractable and also to make it meaningful. And then we did a census of all their publications. So essentially, we had to go and look everybody up online, because frequently some of you have names that sound a lot like other scientists. So we have to go and actually figure out if it's you or not. And we compiled all of these publications and then looked at publication characteristics before and after working groups. And using co-authors as a proxy for collaborative tendencies, again, based on other sociological research, it did demonstrate that people had significantly more co-authors, so probably they were more collaborative as they had predicted after the working groups when they took Ed's survey. And then we also thought about all those residents, all the postdocs who are at the synthesis centers, and they're surrounded by collaboration. They're surrounded by team science, essentially. So do they change? Are their experiences different? Well, the really hard thing about these studies is finding a good outgroup. Who do you compare them to? And in this case, I think we got a pretty darn good outgroup, because NSF supports the bioinformatics postdocs. These are independent, or they're postdocs who get their own funding, and then they go to work in a more traditional lab setting. And so looking at the NSF bioinformatics postdocs who received awards to do ecological research, we then compared those postdocs to the NCEAS postdocs in terms of their publication characteristics. And what we found, not surprisingly, both very productive groups with lots of publications before and after their postdocs, and then also excellent citation rates before and after their postdocs. The big difference was that NCEAS postdocs, after their postdocs, had significantly more authors. And if you dig into some of these numbers on citation rates, you'll see that the elevated citation rate, if it's there, would be attributable to more co-authors. So broader networks and seemingly more collaborative way of doing science as they come out of these synthesis centers. All right, so those are some of the metrics and some of the experience we had at synthesis centers. I think a lot of what I've learned from doing this work with sociologists is that there are some things we haven't really been able to manage or to measure, but that we know are really important based on sociological literature and also observations at NCEAS and our own experiences. And John Parker and I summed up some of these suggestions in a web panel that accompanies this bioscience paper. So one is to encourage diverse viewpoints. Providing leadership in these groups, there are lots of people on this call, I think, who know that it's really hard to provide leadership in these groups. It's not your research group. I'm not the boss of my big research collaborations. And frequently I'm the leader because I'm willing to take on that responsibility, but these people don't report to me. And frequently I'm not paying them. And we are all bringing a suite of skills that are distinctive and complementary. And so it's a very different type of challenge. And one of the things as a leader, and I think as a participant in these groups, that we really have to be committed to is encouraging diverse viewpoints. So this is one of the things that John and Ed felt pretty strongly about when they studied NCEAS, is that they saw the big breakthroughs in groups that would really talk about tough issues and don't sort of converge on groupthink, sort of in an effort to have a pleasant interaction, right? That it's really encouraging the diverse viewpoints and having a vigorous conversation that helps you to get somewhere new. Managing power relations is not just about thinking about some of the early career researchers and making sure that they're protected and nurtured in these groups. It's also about recognizing some of the biases that we have that we didn't even know about. I actually didn't realize until John pointed me towards some of this literature on how frequently scientists, I don't know if it's always or frequently, I'm going to say frequently, scientists walk into a group with all of these biases about who has priority knowledge, ranging from physicists, who people will defer to in a group, to social scientists, who are not deferred to in a group. And those are things that I didn't know anything about that research until John opened my eyes. And it's something to think about as so many of us are engaged in interdisciplinary collaborations. Again, I brought this up earlier, is incentivizing individuals. Again, in these team science groups, frequently the leader doesn't have any real leverage over the other members of the group, except for really leveraging their own excitement to be there and what they're getting out of it. And so it's important to understand what people's incentives are for being there and making sure that they're getting what they need. John and Ed did some work on looking at how NCEAS working groups that were really successful built group cohesion through eating together, socializing together, developing little traditions that their group would undertake together, and really building that kind of group identity. So it's not all about stapling the pieces of paper together that say you're a group, but really about getting to know each other. Ordering the discussion ranges from giving people homework before they show up to the meeting and really clear agenda or a really clear timeline that people that work on from afar, to again, trying to manage some of the power relations. So when you have when you seat people in a face-to-face meeting, really thinking about, okay, there's not anybody sitting at the back of the room where they're going to get ignored. Is everybody really having a literal seat at the table? And John and I provide a little bit more on each of these in that paper. And establishing really clear expectations. And this is if you come away with nothing else from this experience this morning, I really hope it's this. It's that we start talking about these issues before it's awkward. Don't try to introduce an authorship policy after somebody's just been a huge jerk. I mean, yeah, if you didn't do it before, sure, you don't have a time machine, you can't go back and do it right. But really, when you get a group together, get those policies right out there from the very beginning. Talk about these issues early and often, and put these policies in writing. Call them living documents, so that if something changes, somebody goes to a new job or if something changes, you guys can change them. But talk about these early and often before it becomes awkward. And here's a great resource, templates that are in the supplement of Kendra's paper that provide some templates for all of these policies. And I really strongly encourage you, I guess it's getting obvious, really strongly encourage you to develop these for your teams. Well, so I'm hoping that I saved some time to go through questions, and you can see I've highlighted this resource with the templates because I feel so strongly about it. But anything else that might have caught your eye is up here as well. And since this is recorded, you'll have a chance to revisit this page, or just shoot me an email if you are looking for something you can't find. All right.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Everybody, this is I guess your host, Jen Cassell, and we'll handle some questions. I'm sure if you could hear it, you'd hear tons of clapping in the ethersphere, Steph. I know we're clapping here at NCEAS, and that was a fantastic presentation. A couple questions have already come in via the Q&A button, and so everyone who's still on the line, if you go down to your panel, you'll see Q&A. It looks like a little folder, and you can type your questions there, and we will read them. Stephanie, can you read the Q&A panel, or shall I read them to you? That's one thing.
I can read it.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's one, the first one that came in is in the answered category because I dumbly responded to it, which automatically marked it as answered. And that was from Felipe Montez. So maybe if you want to, Steph, you can just run down those while Marty Downs and I here on the other end monitor for any raised hands and so folks, you can also raise your hand and we'll try to call on you. But if that's not working or working promptly, I think the most efficient will be for them, and I'm speaking to you, the audience, to type your question in the Q&A.
Okay.
All right. So, Steph, I'll let you handle the ones in the Q&A bar first.
Yeah. Elizabeth Dobbins says, do you have preferred collaboration tools, Slack, sharing by Google Drive, or just email and meetings? I do. And the thing that I find, so I think Slack is a really great tool because it integrates across communication, and it has really developed great integration with some of the Google tools. So that allows things to be transparent and keep everything in one place. So that's great. So that's my preference. But one of the things that happens is, and this comes up all the time, is that you've got a couple people who are really comfortable with Slack or some other technology that is really useful. and then you have somebody who's really important in the group and is terrified of learning to use that technology. And I think what works best in those cases is to kind of push both parties to compromise a little bit. So for people who, rather than going to the least common denominator and just emailing, Word documents back and forth, it's just so inefficient. It slows the group down so much. And so if those people can do part of it, they can use Google Docs for the document development, but then they still really need you to email. Okay, maybe we can compromise. So I would suggest groups try to do that and just try to be conscious of people's comfort level. Let's see. Oh, I see. I'm now seeing the ordering of these questions. Okay.
And Steph, to remind you, there's a question in the answered category. It was the first one to come in, and it was from Felipe Montez, and it asked, you see it? Okay.
Yeah, I got it. So does the current incentive and demands, number of publications, projects funded, attribution of academia help reinforce the individualistic science patterns? Well, it does and it doesn't. To some extent. So if I work on a bunch of big collaborative project grant proposals, I can't always be the co-PI. And sometimes I'm going to be senior personnel. And that's time that I could spend developing, my own small grant proposal. I think there may be some tension there. But in terms of number of publications, teams, a productive, effective team is producing lots of pubs and lots of high impact stuff. The issue that we still see in some fields is where there are I have heard that there are some departments and maybe some subdisciplines where they're still looking for single author papers or, So for those of us who are in academia and are tenured, we have the opportunity to push on some of those attitudes when we're evaluating our colleagues and to say that teamwork is valuable and it's where a lot of the high impact science is being done. Okay, I'm getting back.
Kelsey King, Steph has a question about, a big question about where you store and log your data sets. Do you see that one?
Yeah, I do.
I know that's a big topic, but I, for one, am interested in hearing your view on this.
Yeah, let's see. So, oh boy. So, there are more options now. So I have been able to use Knowledge Network for biocomplexity. There's also, and I guess the issue that I'm hedging on right now is that a lot of the data repositories have had to restrict who can deposit data because of some of the really large sizes of data sets. Dryad is a place to put data. And I think that I think a lot of us can look at our communities and find the ones that are most used within our subdisciplines. And the thing that I would encourage people to do is to look for some of those that are part of Data One, which is a collaborative network that really networks a lot of these data repositories together, that allows them to mirror the data sets and the metadata, to back up data and provide some more security. I'd also really encourage people, whatever data repository you move towards, to use a standardized metadata language and really document your data sets. So ecological metadata language is one that I think a lot of our community uses, and it's very well integrated with the Morpho tool, which will also allow you to upload to the Knowledge Network for biocomplexity. And And if you don't use EML, I think that's fine as long as you're using a standardized metadata language, even when a data repository doesn't require you to upload a bunch of metadata. Oh, please upload your metadata. I'm sorry, I really went off on a tangent there, Kelsey.
Well, I'm laughing, Stephanie. And I'm sure everybody else is as well. There's no other direct questions right now, but I'll give you all another minute or two to think of questions. And in the meantime, I want to make an announcement that in your tools panel, the bar where you're typing the Q&A, you'll also see a little button called polling. We've just opened a poll. I know everyone's probably going to log off immediately right now, but this is a 2-question poll, and we estimate that the burden on your time will be 10 seconds, literally. It just asks, we'd like to learn where you learned about this webinar to help us with future dissemination of information. And it has a couple other quick questions about your primary scientific activity and how you viewed this webinar. Honestly, it will take you 10 seconds to just take this poll while others are thinking about questions. We'd really appreciate it because it will help us to figure out how to disseminate in the future. So you'll see the poll there. In the meantime, Steph, another question came in from Cora Johnston.
Okay. Oh, I see it. Let's see. Good resources for performance evaluation tools to help with group success reporting. Oh, well, my big sigh will tell you what I think my answer is. Let me think about it for a second, though. I guess I don't have a good answer for you. And I'm trying to think if the Synthesis Consortium might have included any of that information in on their website for how some of the synthesis centers are doing their reporting. I know that NCEAS does post all the NSF annual reports online, so you can see some of the ways that we developed to try to capture some of these unusual kind of evaluation metrics. So I wish I had a better answer, Cora.
Okay, so we're right at the top of the hour, and I just want to, there's a couple more coming in, and we do have a little bit of time, so are these, let's see what we've got. Ooh, yeah. Okay, everyone's thinking of their questions. Starting with Felipe Montez, I hope I'm saying that right. Steph, what do you think about the tools that capture conversations to track arguments and issues?
I haven't done that. Yeah, I haven't used, not beyond note-taking. If you're talking about any specific tools, sorry, I don't know about them. So I guess I've sort of just dropped the ball completely on your question, Felipe. I'm sorry. Should we move on to Jean-Paul?
Yeah, this is a great question about developing countries. Yeah. I think you should read it out loud.
Yeah. Maintaining synthesis centers is very expensive, and as far as I know, the existing centers are all in rich countries, while biodiversity and most urgent environmental problems are mostly in developing or poor countries. Brazil is planning now to have a synthesis center. Do you have any tips for us? Yes, I do. It's really to get in touch, if not already, with this synthesis consortium. And if you didn't pick up the link already, I really think it's just synthesisconsortium.org. If you didn't pick it up already, you can email me if you can't find it. But get in touch with them and become part of that community. So they meet not a lot, but will provide a network to talk about how to do it. And yes, a lot of them are multi-million-dollar endeavors. And then, Canadian Institute for ecology and evolution runs on a much smaller budget. And I think the consortium, that whole network, will help you to find some good approaches. What do you think, Jen?
Well, maybe take this one last question by Andrew McDonald, and then we'll wrap it up of the live part here. I'm sure that Dr. Hampton would be willing to, continue some of these conversations offline. And also, I direct your attention to the chat bar, because folks out there are putting up some pretty interesting resources as well.
Oh, that's great.
So, yeah. So after this last question, we will we'll conclude.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, Andrew. I wonder if you have any insight into how groups should resolve conflicts over methodology, such as statistics. Clearly, they should have a dance-off. That's obvious. But if it's a draw and both parties are equally excellent dancers, then I guess you will have to have a real conversation about it. And I have had this come up, especially in interdisciplinary collaborations, where we didn't even know that our trajectories and our sub-disciplines had developed different methodologies for doing the same darn thing. So John Parker and I recognized that when we were doing multiple regression, his field of sociology, they set up their models a little bit differently than they set them up in ecology. And it's because of pretty, very well thought out arguments about why you would do it one way or another. And in our case, we made a decision based on where we were publishing, where we wanted to publish the article. We wanted to reach ecologists and other biologists. And so we did it the way that a biologist or ecologist would be comfortable with doing it. Yeah.
Great. Okay. We're going to conclude this webinar now, and we would just like to thank everybody for participating in our first webinar of the series. We urge you to check out the schedule on the LTER NCO website. Our next webinars will be on February 8th. It's the same time, same place. You will need to register again separately for each webinar that you participate in. And we welcome feedback as well. Thank you to those of you who did the poll about where you heard about the webinar. If you have any very specific comments, there's a email address in your Zoom invite that you got when you registered, and feel free to let us know how it went and if you have any great ideas. And I would just like to, it's hard, I know everybody's out in ether sphere there, but thank Dr. Stephanie Hampton a lot for such an insightful talk and for stimulating so many great questions, and I'm sure that conversations will continue offline.
I appreciate the opportunity. And for those questions I didn't answer that are in the Q&A, I think I can answer by text. That's what that button says. So I'll give that a try, because you guys asked a lot of really great questions. All right.
Great. Okay. Thanks, everybody. We'll be closing the webinar now.